This is Impact, bringing you all the day's top stories, and later in the programme, more news in depth. I'm Geeta Gurumuthy. The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson threatens to abandon his Brexit bill if he loses a vote to fast-track it through Parliament, and he'll push for an election instead. We'll get the latest in Westminster as he tries to persuade MPs to back his deal. Turkey's President Erdogan threatens to renew his offensive against Syria's Kurds as he meets Vladimir Putin. And pomp and ceremony in Japan as Emperor Naruhito formally ascends to the chrysanthemum throne at Tokyo's Imperial Palace. That's all coming up on Impact. Welcome to the programme. We're live for the next 30 minutes and you can give me your views at Geeta Gurumuthy. The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has told Parliament he will withdraw his Brexit legislation and push for an election if MPs reject his timetable. Today, MPs could pass the first part of the Brexit deal law, but a second vote on fast-tracking Mr Johnson's deal with the EU is less likely to pass. Well, the Prime Minister issued this ultimatum a short time ago.
I will in no way allow months more of this. If Parliament refuses to allow Brexit to happen and instead gets its way and decides to delay everything until January or possibly longer, in those circumstances can the government continue with this. And with great regret, I must go directly to the point that the honourable gentleman raises. With great regret, I must say that the bill will have to be pulled, and we will have to go forward, much as the right honourable gentleman may not like it, we will have to go forward to a general election.
Well, the debate in the House of Commons is still going on. Rob Watson is in Westminster. Rob, there was lots of speculation about what Downing Street would do. What do you make of this announcement today?
Well, I don't think it's entirely surprising, but it seems to me that there's just an incy-wincy bit of wiggle room, Geeta, because the Prime Minister said, look, this couldn't go on for months, and if the EU extended it to January or beyond, there was going to have to be a general election. I think we've known that all along, but it seems to me what he didn't entirely rule out was maybe just a short technical delay. So in other words, if Parliament can't agree to pass this law in 72 hours, would Mr Johnson and the government say, oh, OK, fair enough, we'll give you a few more days, a few more weeks, and leave in the middle of November? I mean, I guess we're only going to find out the answer to that question, Geeta, after the vote at approximately 7:30ish London time this evening.
Yes, I mean, they're trying to fast-track this vote through the Commons in 3 days, Rob. But Number 10 have indicated that if the EU extend until the 31st of January, then they will push for an election before Christmas. And yet, politically, he's boxed himself in a way, hasn't he, the Prime Minister, saying 31st of October, do or die?
He has, but I guess that if he was sitting here, he would say two things. He's rather busy at the moment, so he can't. But if he was sitting here, I think he would say, number one, let's say he does go, let's say there is a short technical extension, so if he loses this business about fast-tracking, he still manages to get his deal done, but maybe in 2, 3 or 4 weeks he could turn around and say, well, look, I got Brexit done under his terms. And even if that doesn't happen, I mean, let's say that doesn't look as though it's possible and he really does pull the bill and go for a general election, you can now see the shape of what that campaign will be like. He's going to say it was Parliament that got in the way, it was the opposition Labour Party that got in the way. If you want to get Brexit done, he's just said that was going to be a slogan, get Brexit done, vote for me. And he will no doubt be aware that in the polls he is way ahead of the Labour Party, a demoralised Labour Party under the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn.
Well, let us hear now from the Labour leader, because he responded to that threat that the bill might be pulled. He's urging Labour MPs, of course, in particular, to vote against the deal, although some might support the government.
My own view is that we should vote against this bill this evening for the reasons that I've set out. I understand her view that it's possible to amend it in committee. That is always the process in Parliament. But my recommendation would be to vote against this bill.
Jeremy Corbyn there, who is still, I think, in the Commons. That debate's still going on. Rob, just to clarify one thing you mentioned there, a short technical extension. Is that any difference to just a short extension? I mean, is this just language and ways of the Prime Minister trying to potentially smooth over that exit date?
No, I meant it in the following way. I mean, let's say the European Union extends the Brexit process until the 31st of January. What I meant more was this, that Mr. Johnson could take the view, do you know what, maybe if he wins that first vote just on the sort of general principle of the bill, he could take the view, well, maybe I couldn't get this bill through Parliament in 72 hours, but maybe I could get it done by the middle of November, and might that really be the end of the world? I mean, it seems to me that he didn't rule that out.
Exactly, and that's still, as you said, something that we will learn today. So just talk us through the chronology, the time frame as we know it at the moment today.
Right, so the first thing that happens at around about 7 o'clock is that MPs will vote on what's known as the second reading of the bill, just fancy old-fashioned way of saying they'll just have a straight vote on this idea of, do you think, in general, that this deal isn't that bad and that we should go ahead and act it, put it into British law? And it's thought that there probably will be a small majority for that deal that Mr. Johnson reached with the EU last week. And then about 15 minutes or so after that, they will have another vote on something which is normally like super snooze, right? The programme motion. You know, who cares about stuff like that? But in this case, it's extraordinary because the government is saying, well, actually, if you like our deal, what about getting it all passed by the end of Thursday night? And that vote is the one that we're thinking could be a lot closer. I mean, I actually think, Geeta, if you were to ask me which way do I think it would go, I'm not going to be stupid enough to answer that when I could be 50% right or wrong in the next few hours. But I would say it depends on this, whether enough MPs who they don't like that deal that much, but they're willing to go along with it. They think doing it in 72 hours is also a really, really dumb idea. But I was so entirely sick of any kind of further delays with Brexit that with all those reservations in their hearts, they still nod it through.
Just very briefly, how does Boris Johnson get an election? Because that's also not straightforward.
It's not. I mean, I think he would get it because everybody in British politics would recognise this just can't go on any longer.
OK, Rob Watson, thanks very much indeed. We will talk soon.
And I'm very grateful to the Home Secretary.
Well, let's move on now away from British politics. And the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has warned that he will resume the military offensive against the Kurds in northeastern Syria when a ceasefire ends in a few hours' time, unless the withdrawal of Kurdish fighters is completed. The Turkish leader has been meeting Vladimir Putin in Sochi to discuss the highly dangerous situation that's developed in northern Syria after the withdrawal of US troops. Well, as the talks got underway, Russia's foreign ministry reportedly said that Turkey's incursion into Syria was violating Syria's territorial integrity. I spoke to our correspondent Sarah Rainsford, who's in Sochi, and Barbara Pletasher, who's been on the Turkey-Syria border. And I began by asking Sarah what both leaders wanted from the meeting.
Well, I think there's a big difference between the setting here, the very relaxed setting of President Putin's residence on the Black Sea, with the very critical nature of these talks taking place here. President Putin, as he met President Erdogan of Turkey, in fact described the situation in northeastern Syria as acute and said that these talks between Turkey and Russia now were absolutely critical, he said, very much needed to resolve that situation. So I think, a sense of urgency around the situation, of course, as we are just hours now from the time when that 5-day ceasefire negotiated by the Americans, the halt, the pause in Turkey's military operation in northeastern Syria is set to run out. So I think Russia's role is now critical. It has set itself up very much as the key mediator in the Syrian crisis, and specifically when it comes to the situation in the northeast, I think Russia is now playing a critical role.
Sarah, thanks for that for now. Let's just cross to Barbara Pletasher, who is on that Turkey-Syria border. What is the sense there with the hours ticking down to the ceasefire running out?
Well, the Kurdish forces, the Kurdish-led SDF forces are withdrawing, we understand. President Erdogan has said that 700 to 800 units have already left. And there are still 1,200 to 1,300 more units to go, but they're moving very quickly. So the aim is to pull out of this area by the end of the day. And of course, we are talking about a central zone of the Turkish-Syrian border. It's about 120 kilometers long. The western boundary of it is the town of Tal Abyad, which you can see in the far distance just behind me there. And what's happening is that the people who are east of this zone are quite afraid. They don't know what's going to happen once the deadline has ended. We are hearing reports that they are leaving a town right next down the line, afraid that they might be that the Turks might move there if the incursion resumes. We also understand that there has been reinforcements on both sides of the border. So militias that are allied to the Turks have been deployed to an area near the town of Kamishli, further east. And on the other side, on the Syrian side of the border, we're hearing reports that Syrian troops have also moved closer to the border in that area because, of course, the Kurds have asked the Syrians to help them protect their cities after the U.S. military decided to leave. So it sounds, Gita, like the military element is getting into position depending on what's going to happen when the deadline ends. But what happens in Sochi will probably determine whether the incursion or the offensive continues or whether there could be a political solution.
And Sarah, just going back to you, obviously with the withdrawal of the US now, Russia is one of the key players again in the region. Isn't that the case?
I think that's true. I mean, certainly that's a position that's been building for some years, ever since Russia intervened militarily and turned the tide of this war in favour of Syria's President Bashar al-Assad. In recent times, that position that Russia has adopted, that position as a mediator, as a power broker in the region, has only intensified. And certainly, as you say, the withdrawal of American troops from the northeast of Syria has added to that role that Russia's playing. I think, Russia is revelling in that role, certainly. It's also revelling, I would say, in the upset and the chaos that there is politically in the United States over the decision that Donald Trump took to withdraw American troops from that region. Certainly, Russia is enjoying the fact that it's now being seen as the reliable partner in Syria and broadly in the Middle East. It's a role it's been angling for, and it now feels that it's fulfilling.
Sarah Rainsford there in Sochi, where those meetings have been taking place, and Barbara Pletasher on the Turkey-Syria border. In Bolivia, clashes have broken out as it was announced that President Evo Morales appeared set to win re-election, despite it originally looking like the vote was heading towards a second round. Ballot boxes have been set on fire and demonstrators have battled with police in the capital La Paz. Counting was halted on Sunday, but when it resumed, President Morales had just enough to win outright. His rival Carlos Mesa has refused to recognise the result. The Chilean president, Sebastián Piñera, says he's willing to meet opposition leaders and work to lessen inequality in the country. His pledge follows violent protests against rising living costs. A state of emergency is already in place in the capital, Santiago. 15 people have been killed in the unrest. Still to come here on Impact, the phenomenal success of the Toronto Raptors basketball team. We'll meet the coach who's behind it all.
Sorry. Think this is funny? Is this a joke to you?
It's so awful, isn't it?
Are you having any negative thoughts?
There are many who prey on the innocent. I'm sure your kind would agree. If I didn't know better, I'd say you were making a threat. Well, do you? Do I what? No better.
This is Impact on BBC World News. A reminder of our top story this hour. The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has told Parliament he will withdraw his Brexit legislation and push for an election if MPs reject his timetable and if the EU extends the deadline until the end of January. Now, Justin Trudeau has held on to power in Canada but has lost his majority. With most results in, Mr Trudeau's Liberal Party is ahead of the main challenger, the opposition Conservatives, led by Andrew Scheer. Well, the Conservatives are expected to win the popular vote, but that's not translated into seats. The Liberals are projected to win 157 seats, 14 short of a majority, which means Mr Trudeau will be the leader of a minority government. Well, as the results came in, there was a lot of excitement and relief at Liberal Party HQ in Montreal. Mr Trudeau told his ecstatic supporters they'd voted in favour of a progressive agenda by re-electing him. Well, our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette, is in Toronto for us. Lise, a fascinating few hours there.
Yes, excitement and drama last night as the results were confirmed. But this morning on this grey day, certainly here in Toronto, it's a time for sober analysis of those numbers. Look at the headlines in the papers. The main Toronto Daily
That represented 33% of the popular vote, and with a turnout of say 66%, the fact is 4 in 5 Canadians who are eligible to cast a ballot either voted for someone else or didn't vote for the Liberals or didn't vote at all. So it's hard to say that the country was behind the Liberals in any sense.
at a time of climate action. Does this spell trouble?
Well, the Liberals were shut out in Alberta, and if you look at the electoral map of Canada, the middle is blue. The Prairie and Western provinces up to British Columbia are blue. That means it's going to be tough for the Liberals to have representation from the West in their cabinet. A few premiers, including Premier Kenney of Alberta, are on the offensive against the federal government. So it's going to be, it was a tough 4 years for Justin Trudeau already with the West. It'll be a tougher 2 years, let's say the minority hangs on for 2 years, before we head to the next election.
Hard-fought campaign, very, very close, going down to the wire. So much discussion through the night as to whether Andrew Scheer of the Conservatives, fighting his first election, many say, given Trudeau's last year of scandals, he could have done better?
Yeah, he almost certainly could have. I mean, part of the challenge was the Conservatives needed to grow their party. Now, that said, they did. They had a greater share of the popular vote. They had something like 21 more seats this time around. So they did improve on their 2015 effort, but they also fell short of their success under Stephen Harper. So I suspect Conservatives will be melancholic today, and there'll be some sort of post-mortem where they look at what went wrong. And I would suggest they start by looking at how they failed to grow the party to the next 10% that they needed to form government.
Next step for Justin Trudeau?
Well, to try to find a way to rally some support with either either and perhaps the New Democrats and the Bloc Québécois. I mean, he's in a situation where he doesn't need any more than one party to push on in votes in the House of Commons. He can either work with the Bloc or the NDP or even the Conservatives on some matter. So now it'll be alliance building so that he can get some legislation through.
So the politics certainly isn't over. In fact, it might get a lot harder. David Moscow, thank you for being with us here today in Toronto as we continue to analyse what's been generally described as what the closest election race Canadians have seen in years. And now, looking at that electoral map, we're looking at a very complicated politics too.
OK, very good to see you as always, Lise, there live in Toronto for us. In June, the Toronto Raptors made history after winning their first NBA title. The prestigious basketball league was only expanded to include Canadian sides in 1995, so victory against the more prestigious American teams was a massive breakthrough. Well, the man who masterminded the Raptors' astonishing success was head coach Nick Nurse. Our correspondent Katie Gornall went to meet him.
It's been a wild ride for the Toronto Raptors, even more so for their coach Nick Nurse. This was how Canada celebrated last summer as he delivered the biggest prize in basketball in his first season in the NBA. It was the pinnacle of a near 30-year coaching career that has covered some miles and has its roots in Britain.
There was things I was pulling out in the NBA Finals. Those were things I was using back in 1995-96 in the British Basketball League. So it's just all kind of come full circle, and it's similar, right? We were doing the same things at Derby, trying to figure out how we were going to beat Leicester, but just different time, different players, different skill level, but very similar. Basketball's basketball, really.
Nick Nurse knows how to celebrate, doesn't he?
British basketball fans remember him well. He spent 11 years in the league, finishing on a high with the Brighton Bears. He brought success to every club he coached.
He's won every trophy on offer.
8 trophies were lifted on a journey that started when he was a fresh-faced player-coach straight out of college.
I think I first went to England as a 22-year-old, and I was coaching the Derby Rams at the time as a head coach, and I was just trying to work my craft and figure out if I was any good at it. And it was, a kind of low-budget situation, low-budget team. I remember I wasn't old enough to drive the team van, so my starting center had to drive the van, and I sat in the passenger side. I remember the minibus. I remember it breaking down out in the middle of the country one time and wondering where am I and what the heck am I doing here? All those things.
Defended by Simmons. Is this the target?
Life has since changed dramatically. Last year, a series of incredible victories saw his Toronto Raptors secure their first NBA championship.
And the game winner!
Yet in a league bursting with international talent, British success stories are few and far between.
It's a tremendous worldwide sport, right, that seems like the UK is kind of missing out on. There just seems to still be a bit of an infrastructure problem of enough kids having a place to play and quality coaching. Where and how we get there seems to be about a 30-year battle now. It always seems to be a big leap forward and then 6 or 7 steps back.
The Toronto Raptors, this, again, massive celebration underway.
What was once a distant dream is now a reality for Nick Nurse. It's been an unconventional journey to the top, but now he's arrived. The pressure's on to stay there. Katie Gornall, BBC News.
Well, Emperor Naruhito in Japan has formally ascended the chrysanthemum throne in what was a scaled-down but lavish ceremony. Making a formal proclamation, Naruhito promised to fulfil his duty as a symbol of the Japanese state. Our correspondent Rupert Wingfield-Hayes is in Tokyo following proceedings and has this report.
It is a vision of Japan at its most traditional. The new emperor and empress in their full and very heavy imperial robes. Courtiers dressed as if from a samurai epic. Naruhito's grandfather was considered a god. Today the new emperor declared more modest ambitions. I pledge to fulfill my responsibility as the symbol of the state and unity of the people of Japan, he said. The foreign royals present may not have realised it, but this ceremony is not without controversy. For some, Prime Minister Abe's shouting of "Long live the Emperor" smacks of emperor worship. They say it breaches Japan's post-war constitution. But for most Japanese, the focus today is on the new imperial couple, educated at Oxford and Harvard.
The new emperor and empress are good with foreign languages, so I think it will be very effective for Japan's diplomacy.
I'm old, so I wanted to see this while I still can. I'm very happy to be here on such a special day.
Although Emperor Naruhito took over the throne back in May, for most Japanese people, today is the real high point of the imperial succession handover. It's the first time they've seen their new emperor and empress in their imperial regalia ascend the high throne and for the emperor to address the people from there. Today's ceremonies have, however, been overshadowed, not just by the gloomy weather, but by the devastation wrought on Japan last week by Typhoon Hagibis. When his father ascended the throne back in 1989, it was followed by a public parade, the royal couple riding in an open-top Rolls-Royce. Today's identical parade has been cancelled out of respect for the 80 people who died in last week's typhoon. Japanese people are going to have to wait a little longer to greet their new imperial couple. Rupert Wingfield-Hayes, BBC News, in Tokyo.
Let me just remind you of our top story this hour. And Boris Johnson is trying to get 2 key votes through the Commons on his deal today. One is the first outline of the vote, which he might win, but a second one to fast-track the vote is more difficult for him. He says if he loses that, he will pull the legislation if the EU extends the Brexit deadline until the 31st of January. And the politics of that really is about Boris Johnson saying, do or die, he is going to deliver Brexit by the 31st of October. If he loses one of today's votes, he cannot deliver that promise. Much more, of course, all day here on BBC World News. I'm on Twitter too, @Geeta Gurmurthy. Thanks for watching.